That's a 10. That's a good one. Yeah.
Attention, America is on the brink of an aviation crisis that could overshadow all previous trade wars. What began as yet another attempt to protect the domestic market has already escalated into an international conflict that threatens to disrupt global supply chains and cause prices to plummet on world stock exchanges. The US has imposed new tariffs on aircraft and aircraft parts, a move that has hit not only foreign suppliers but also Americans themselves. Emergency measures are being discussed behind the scenes at the White House, but it is already clear that the consequences will affect everyone who takes to the skies.
And police in Italy are investigating possible arson after a fire destroyed more than a dozen Tesla vehicles. Elon Musk is calling the incident at a Rome dealership terrorism. This comes as Tesla has been the target of recent protests around the world.
Canada and Mexico, two key allies of Washington and major suppliers of aircraft parts, have reacted harshly. For the first time in 15 years, Ottawa and Mexico City have filed a joint protest against the US, threatening not only mirror tariffs, but also withdrawal from civil aviation agreements. Their economists are blunt. If the situation does not change by July 8th, there will be a wave of aircraft factory closures, layoffs and price increases that we will feel at airports as early as next month. Aircraft undergoing repairs will wait weeks, if not months, for parts. Domestic flights within the US from New York to Los Angeles, from Chicago to Houston could double in price.
There's been a lot of on and off, some inconsistency.
There's no inconsistency. I'm not like a block that just, I won't delay. It's called flexibility. It's not called inconsistency. It's called flexibility.
Meanwhile, panic is spreading in Seattle and Toulouse, the headquarters of Boeing and Airbus. Engineers are sounding the alarm. Even a short-term halt in deliveries could paralyze production for years. They say that one of the largest contracts between Boeing and Southwest Airlines has already been put on hold. Airlines are urgently reviewing routes, cutting flights, and canceling orders for new aircraft. According to information from closed sources, American aircraft assembly unions have begun secret consultations with their European partners. For the first time since 2008, the issue of moving production capacity outside the US is on the agenda.
US President Donald Trump has announced a 25% tariff on all car and light truck imports into the country. It's due to come into effect on April 2nd. Economists and world leaders are warning that it will be a tax on consumers and have a chilling effect on the global economy. But to Americans, Trump paints a rosy picture, predicting that the levies will spur growth.
But the most alarming thing is the position of the White House. The administration is not simply insisting on the economic feasibility of these tariffs, it is invoking Section 232 of the Trade Act, citing national security concerns. This sets a dangerous precedent. If everything related to aircraft is now a matter of national security, other industries, from satellites to software, could also be threatened. Economists warn that this is no longer just a conflict, but a point of no return. What will happen next? Will there be a compromise? Or are we witnessing the beginning of the most destructive tariff war in aviation history? The answer will be revealed in the coming minutes.
After weeks of whiplash, Trump threatening tariffs, imposing some and walking back others, many Americans are feeling the uncertainty. In Swisher, Iowa, distillery owner Jeff Quint says it's paralyzing.
The bourbon industry is going to be collateral damage in this tariff war. I don't really think there's any way around that.
And he's not alone. Tonight, the majority of Americans, 61%, now say they disapprove of how the president is handling tariffs. 56% say they disapprove of his handling of the economy overall. But the president has dismissed those concerns tonight, saying he has the right to change course.
It all started with a statement that on a normal morning might have gone unnoticed. However, on June 3rd, when the US Department of Commerce published a new list of tariff initiatives, it became clear that changes were coming that would shake the aviation and automotive industries across North America. It was not only Chinese manufacturers that were hit, as had been the case in the past. Now Washington has set its sights on its closest trading partners, Canada and Mexico. The provinces of Ontario and Quebec, where the largest manufacturers of passenger cars, bus chassis, and electric car components are concentrated, found themselves on the front line. A few days later, Tesla's largest chassis supplier, Canadian company Veltec Systems, was forced to temporarily suspend shipments of components. The reason is not only tariffs, but also the refusal of U.S. customs authorities to allow shipments into the U.S. without additional certification, which was not previously required.
After Trump imposed those sweeping 25% tariffs on aluminum and steel imports, the European Union retaliating with tariffs on up to $28 billion of U.S. goods. Trump making it clear this isn't over, vowing to respond in kind with sweeping retaliatory tariffs early next month.
However, truly alarming signals began to emerge from another sector, aerospace. Over the past 2 years, amid recovery growth following the pandemic, companies on both sides of the border have been ramping up production. Bombardier, Pratt & Whitney Canada, Safran, and dozens of subcontractors have invested billions of dollars in modernizing their facilities. The new round of tariff pressure was not only unexpected, it threatened hundreds of contracts and thousands of jobs. On June 6th, Quebec authorities held a closed-door meeting with the heads of the 5 largest aerospace companies. According to sources, plans were discussed to partially transfer production to EU countries, primarily Poland and Portugal. This would have been an unprecedented step. For the first time, Canada could have lost control over key components of its high-tech industry. At the same time, Boeing urgently revised its delivery schedule for Canadian engines for its new 737 MAX model, fearing delays that could result in millions of dollars in fines.
But I think you're going to remember today, it's going to be a free nation that we're dealing with. We're going to have a very free and beautiful nation. It's going to be Liberation Day in America, and it's going to be a day that hopefully you're going to look back in years to come and you're going to say, you know, he was right. This has turned out to be one of the most important days in the history of our country.
Meanwhile, the second stage of the conflict began in Washington. Under the guise of protecting the domestic market, the White House initiated a 10% tariff on imported aircraft and components. Although the official statement said that this would primarily affect long-haul airliners from China, in reality the list turned out to be much broader. The new rules cover parts manufactured in Canada, the UK, and Germany, as well as almost the entire range of components from Mexico, from fuselage elements to interior panels for the cockpit. Worse still, the US Department of Commerce has launched a new anti-crisis investigation, which could result in a decision to raise tariffs to 25% or even higher. This prospect instantly sent the shares of a number of companies plummeting. Bombardier's securities fell 14% in a day, while the shares of US supplier Spirit Aerosystems collapsed 19%. Despite being based in the US, the market saw this as a sign of an inevitable chain reaction in the coming months. The whole supply chain could be rebuilt from scratch. Experts unanimously agree that the consequences could be devastating. A modern aircraft is not a product of a single country. It is a mosaic assembled from thousands of components sourced from around the world. The fuselage comes from the US, the engine from Canada, the navigation system from Germany, the seats from Mexico, and the electronic components from South Korea. The introduction of tariffs on even one group of parts could halt the production of entire aircraft. Small and medium-sized carriers, which depend on the rapid replacement of components and deliveries under maintenance contracts, will be particularly affected. In July, if the new wave of tariffs comes into force, aviation hubs in Dallas, Fort Worth, Atlanta, and Chicago could collapse. Some aircraft will be grounded while waiting for permits and deliveries.
Ready? The higher the tariff, the more likely it is that the company will come into the United States and build a factory in the United States so it doesn't have to pay the tariff.
That will take many, as you know, that will take many years.
In fact, I'll tell you, you know, there's another theory is that the tariff, you make it so high, so horrible, so obnoxious that they'll come right away. When I do the 10%, 10% is really, first of all, 10% when you collect it is hundreds of billions of dollars. The
we
numbers that you're talking, all reducing our deficit. But really, so there's two ways of looking at a tariff. You can do it as a money-making instrument, or you can do it as something to get the companies. Now, if you want the companies to come in.
Unofficially, White House officials already acknowledge that the consequences were underestimated. According to information leaked from one of the briefings, U.S. Transportation Secretary Peter Slotin said at a closed meeting that the real threat is not China, but that we are creating a broken mechanism ourselves. However, publicly, the administration continues to insist that its decisions are correct. Article 232 of the Trade Expansion Act is being used, a legal provision that allows trade restrictions to be imposed under the pretext of a threat to national security. This is a dangerous precedent if aircraft are already a security issue. What is to prevent similar measures being introduced against suppliers of software, satellite communication systems, navigation units, and even autopilot components? Against this backdrop, analysts warn that if the Section 232 mechanism is expanded, the tariff logic could even extend to passenger trains and electric buses manufactured with foreign investment.
We begin with the president's trade war escalating tonight. This evening, the retaliation against the United States, Canada, and the European Union responding quickly, just hours after President Trump's 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum coming into the United States. Canada, the largest supplier of steel to the U.S., slapping new tariffs on $20 billion worth of U.S. goods that are sold in Canada. And the 27 countries of the European Union imposing retaliatory tariffs on up to $28 billion worth of U.S. goods sold in Europe.
Meanwhile, the situation is rapidly spiraling out of control. Panic is growing among logistics specialists, engineers, and transport managers across North America. The estimated cost of international flights for fall 2025 has already been increased by 12 to 18% in some booking systems. Canada is reporting frozen deliveries on 16 contracts with U.S. customers, and Mexico has already lost a $180 million order from a major U.S. carrier that has opted to redirect funds to upgrade its existing fleet. This is only the beginning. Ahead, according to Canadian Economy Minister Marisol Dupree, is a wave of reciprocal restrictions that could undermine the foundations of trust that have been built over decades.
With Elon Musk's views on weighing into very much national politics, national elections in Europe. And then on top of that, when you see the backdrop of Tesla upgrading its product line and the impact of them trying to chase more sales at the back end of last year, that means it's short on inventory. It can't necessarily sell as many vehicles or doesn't have as many in stock to sell. So there is that issue there of a confluence of impacts, which means that sales have been falling. Again, the question is how much more that will impact into February as well, given that the back end of last year in 2024, Tesla sales did slip overall.
The pressure is growing every day. Politicians, businesses, airlines, and passengers are beginning to realize that the situation can no longer be managed through negotiations. It has entered a phase of economic turmoil. And if no countermeasures are taken in the coming weeks, the world could face the biggest aviation disruption in the history of the 21st century, the Tati. The reaction to the US actions was not long in coming. Just 48 hours after the official confirmation of the new tariffs, Canada and Mexico issued a strong statement signed by the heads of the trade ministries of both countries. This step was unprecedented for the first time in 20 years. Both US allies filed a formal protest with the World Trade Organization, accusing Washington of violating the spirit and letter of civil aviation agreements. The document, which ran to more than 140 pages, described not only the direct economic damage, but also the potential threat to the stability of the entire transport system of the continent. Although the protest was formally worded in legal terms, its political subtext was clear. This is not just an economic dispute, but the beginning of a new phase of trade confrontation. At closed-door talks in Brussels, representatives of European aircraft manufacturers openly expressed their concern. According to them, the paralysis of supply chains between the US and Canada could lead to the collapse of many long-term fleet modernization programs. In particular, they mentioned a joint initiative by Airbus and Pratt & Whitney to produce a new generation engine, whose production was divided between Toulouse, Montreal, and Phoenix. The threat of additional certification and duties effectively put an end to the preliminary testing phase. A representative of Swiss logistics company Tull Global, who wished to remain anonymous, said that more than 900 containers with parts for the Airbus A220 were stuck in transit between Halifax, Canada, and the port of Baltimore. According to him, the problem has already cost the company $3.7 million. All this is happening against a backdrop of growing pressure from industry analysts, who warn of risks not only to logistics but also to the very sustainability of airlines. In Canada, exports of aircraft engines and components to the US are estimated at $9 billion annually, and in Mexico at nearly $1.5 billion. These amounts are not just numbers, they are vital flows that sustain hundreds of factories, tens of thousands of jobs, and the entire rapid support system for air transport operations. If these chains are broken, and that is where we are headed, a domino effect will begin. Factories will start to close, there will be disruptions in aircraft maintenance, and ticket prices will skyrocket. Emergency meetings are already being held in Mexico City and Monterrey with the owners of fuselage manufacturers, many of whom are considering shifting their business to Asian and South American markets. One factory in Nuevo León has already received an offer from China's Avic worth $72 million on condition that it completely renounces its contracts with the US. A wave of warnings has begun in the aviation industry itself. US airlines, including United and Delta, have sent a joint letter to the White House emphasizing that the tariffs will lead to a sharp increase in operating costs. Whereas previously parts were purchased using optimized schemes with minimal logistical delays, now each component requires a separate customs permit and verification of compliance with the new rules. This bureaucratic wall has already caused delays in aircraft repairs and scheduled maintenance, especially in the regional aviation segment. Experts warn that if the situation does not normalize by September, up to 23% of all domestic flights in the US will be at risk of cancellation. Aircraft manufacturers have also begun to take action. Boeing has announced that it is reviewing its contract with one of its largest cable system suppliers in Ontario. Airbus has announced a temporary freeze on purchases of avionics from Mexico. Moreover, against the backdrop of the general crisis, companies have begun to actively build up their own logistics reserves, temporary storage warehouses in neutral zones, such as the Bahamas, where duties have not yet come into force. This decision is essentially a forced attempt to maintain the continuity of supply chains, albeit at the cost of a temporary increase in the cost of processes. However, one of the most alarming signals came from major transport alliances. The Star Alliance, which includes dozens of airlines from around the world, has said that it is ready to review its route network for North America amid the uncertainty. If the situation escalates, the most unprofitable and risky routes, such as Canada, US, and Mexico, US, may be suspended. Analysts have estimated that this would result in direct losses of $600 to $800 million per quarter. But companies are willing to take these measures to avoid being held hostage by paralyzed hubs. At the end of June, Lufthansa announced the cancellation of direct flights from Frankfurt to Boston via Montreal, and Turkish Airlines announced that it would replace transit through Canada with routes via Ireland. In response to all this, the Mexican authorities have begun preparing a large-scale economic protection package. Among the measures being considered are the introduction of retaliatory duties on U.S. aircraft, restrictions on U.S. airlines' access to domestic flights, and tax incentives for European and Asian partners willing to replace the U.S. in logistics chains. Canada, in turn, is considering a partial withdrawal from the NAACA Civil Aviation Agreement if the U.S. does not withdraw its tariff initiatives within the next 30 days. This step could be historic. The agreement, signed in 1995, was considered a cornerstone of transatlantic aviation integration. And while officials are drafting new memoranda, experts are already saying that the consequences will be inevitable. In the coming months, the market expects a surge in airfares, an increase in aircraft maintenance costs, a freeze on major investment projects, and the emergence of grey routes, where parts and equipment will be delivered bypassing official channels via Panama, the Dominican Republic, or even Iceland. All this poses a real threat, not only to the industry but also to millions of passengers whose usual routes will be disrupted by a wave of fare increases, with America and its closest allies at the epicenter. The global consequences are already beginning to be felt. Bookings for the fall in major booking systems Amadeus and Sabre fell by 12% compared to the same period last year. Airlines are suspending the recruitment of pilots and technical personnel. Some international carriers are already considering canceling their participation in joint code-sharing agreements with US operators. This means that the familiar model of fly one flight, buy two tickets may disappear from the market. For now, every day brings new alarming data. Analysts are calling this the most significant disruption in the history of transcontinental aviation. And although solutions are still possible, the window for compromise is rapidly closing. The consequences are already visible to every passenger, from flight delays to new prices in search engines. But the real outcome is still ahead. The coming weeks will determine whether the crisis will be a short-lived storm or permanently change the rules of the game in the global aviation arena.